A Pushlatch is a gift-giving feast practiced by indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast of Canada and the United States, among whom it is traditionally the primary economic system. This includes the Heiltsuk, Haida, Nuxalk, Tlingit, Makah, Tsimshian, Nuu-chah-nulth, Kwakwaka'wakw, and Coast Salish cultures. Pushlatches are also a common feature of the peoples of the interior and of the Subarctic adjoining the northwest coast, though mostly without the elaborate ritual and gift-giving economy of the coastal peoples. Pushlatches went through a history of rigorous ban by both the Canadian and United States federal governments, continuing underground despite the risk of criminal punishment, and have been studied by many anthropologists. Since the practice was decriminalized in the post-war years, the Pushlatch has re-emerged in some communities. The word comes from the Chinook jargon, meaning to give away, or a gift. Originally from the Nuu-chah-nulth word paa, to make a ceremonial gift in a Pushlatch. Overview. NB. This overview concerns the Kwakwaka'wakw Pushlatch. Pushlatch traditions and formalities and kinship systems in other cultures of the region differ, often substantially. A Pushlatch was held on the occasion of births, deaths, adoptions, weddings, and other major events. Typically the Pushlatch was practiced more in the winter seasons as historically the warmer months were for procuring wealth for the family, clan, or village, then coming home and sharing that with neighbors and friends. The event was hosted by a Nuu-chah-nulth, or house, in Kwakwaka'wakw culture. A Nuu-chah-nulth was a complex Kofnatic kin group usually headed by aristocrats, but including commoners and occasional slaves. It had about 100 members and several would be grouped together into a tribe. The house drew its identity from its ancestral founder, usually a mythical animal who descended to earth and removed his animal mask, thus becoming human. The mask became a family heirloom passed from father to son along with the name of the ancestor himself. This made him the leader of the Nuu-chah-nulth, considered the living incarnation of the founder. Only aristocrats could host a Pushlatch. The Pushlatch was the occasion on which titles associated with masks and other objects were fastened onto a new office holder. Two kinds of titles were transferred on these occasions. Firstly, each Nuu-chah-nulth had a number of named positions of ranked seats transferred within itself. These ranked titles granted rights to hunting, fishing and burying territories. Secondly, there were a number of titles that would be passed between Nuu-chah-nulth, usually to in-laws, which included feast names that gave one a role in the winter ceremonial. Aristocrats felt safe giving these titles to their out-marrying daughter's children because this daughter and her children would later be rejoined with her natal Nuu-chah-nulth when the titles returned with them. Any one individual might have several seats, which allowed them to sit, in rank order, according to their title, as the host displayed and distributed wealth and made speeches. Besides the transfer of titles at a Pushlatch, the event was given weight by the distribution of other less important objects such as keycat blankets, animal skins and coppers. It is the distribution of large numbers of Hudson Bay blankets, and the destruction of valued coppers that first drew government attention to the Pushlatch. Dorothy Johansson describes the dynamic. In the Pushlatch, the host in effect challenged a guest chieftain to exceed him in his power to give away or to destroy goods. If the guest did not return 100% on the gifts received and destroy even more wealth in a bigger and better bonfire, he and his people lost face and so his power was diminished. Hierarchical relations within and between clans, villages, and nations, were observed and reinforced through the distribution or sometimes destruction of wealth, dance performances, and other ceremonies. The status of any given family is raised not by who has the most resources, but by who distributes the most resources. The hosts demonstrate their wealth and prominence through giving away goods. For some cultures, such as Kwakwaka'wakw, elaborate and theatrical dances are performed reflecting the host's genealogy and cultural wealth. Many of these dances are also sacred ceremonies of secret societies like the Hamata, or display of family origin from supernatural creatures such as the Tlingit. Chief Owaksi ±I ±Lugai ±Lees of the Kwagyu Angstrom describes the Pushlatch in his famous speech to anthropologist Franz Boas. We will dance when our laws command us to dance, we will feast when our hearts desire to feast. do we ask the white man, do as the Indian does? No, we do not. Why, then, will you ask us, do as the white man does? It is a strict law that bids us to dance. It is a strict law that bids us to distribute our property among our friends and neighbors. It is a good law. Let the white man observe his law. We shall observe ours. And now, if you are come to forbid us to dance, begone. If not, you will be welcome to us. It is important to note the differences and uniqueness among the different cultural groups and nations along the coast. Each nation, tribe, and sometimes clan has its own way of practicing the Pushlatch with diverse presentation and meaning. The Pushlatch, as an overarching term, is quite general, since some cultures have many words in their language for various specific types of gatherings. It is important to keep this variation in mind as most of our detailed knowledge of the Pushlatch was acquired from the Kwakwaka'wakw around Fort Rupert on Vancouver Island in the period 1849 to 1925, a period of great social transition in which many features became exaggerated in reaction to British colonialism. History. Before the arrival of the Europeans, gifts included storable food, canoes, slaves, and ornamental coppers among aristocrats, but not resource-generating assets such as hunting, fishing and burying territories. Coppers were sheets of beaten copper, shield-like in appearance. They were about 2 feet long, wider on top, cruciform frame and schematic face on the top half. None of the copper used was ever of indigenous metal. A copper was considered the equivalent of a slave. They were only ever owned by individual aristocrats, and never by Nuu-chah-nulth, hence could circulate between groups. Coppers began to be produced in large numbers after the colonization of Vancouver Island in 1849 when war and slavery were ended. The arrival of Europeans resulted in the introduction of numerous diseases against which indigenous peoples had no immunity, resulting in a massive population decline. Competition for the fixed number of Pushlatch titles grew as commoners began to seek titles from which they had previously been excluded by making their own remote or dubious claims validated by a Pushlatch. Aristocrats increased the size of their gifts in order to retain their titles and maintain social hierarchy. This resulted in massive inflation in gifting made possible by the introduction of mass-produced trade goods in the late 18th and earlier 19th centuries. Pushlatch ban equals. Pushlatching was made illegal in Canada in 1884 in an amendment to the Indian Act and the United States in the late 19th century, largely at the urging of missionaries and government agents who considered it a worse than useless custom that was seen as wasteful, unproductive, and contrary to civilized values of accumulation. The Pushlatch was seen as a key target in assimilation policies and agendas. Missionary William Duncan wrote in 1875 that the Pushlatch was by far the most formidable of all obstacles in the way of Indians becoming Christians, or even civilized. Thus in 1884, the Indian Act was revised to include clauses banning the Pushlatch and making it illegal to practice. Section 3 of the Act read: Every Indian or other person who engages in or assists in celebrating the Indian festival known as the Pushlatch, or the Indian dance known as the Tsimshian is guilty of a misdemeanor, and shall be liable to imprisonment for a term not more than 6 nor less than 2 months in any jail or other place of confinement. And, any Indian or other person who encourages either directly or indirectly, an Indian or Indians to get up such a festival or dance, or to celebrate the same, or who shall assist in the celebration of same is guilty of a like offense, and shall be liable to the same punishment. In 1888, the anthropologist Franz Boas described the Pushlatch ban as a failure. The second reason for the discontent among the Indians is a law that was passed, some time ago, forbidding the celebrations of festivals. The so-called Pushlatch of all these tribes hinders the single families from accumulating wealth. It is the great desire of every chief and even of every man to collect a large amount of property, and then to give a great Pushlatch, a feast in which all is distributed among his friends, and, if possible, among the neighboring tribes. These feasts are so closely connected with the religious ideas of the natives, and regulate their mode of life to such an extent, that the Christian tribes near Victoria have not given them up. Every present received at a Pushlatch has to be returned at another Pushlatch, and a man who would not give his feast in due time would be considered as not paying his debts. Therefore the law is not a good one, and cannot be enforced without causing general discontent. Besides, the government is unable to enforce it. The settlements are so numerous, and the Indian agents is so large, that there is nobody to prevent the Indians doing whatsoever they like. Eventually the Pushlatch law, as it became known, was amended to be more inclusive and address technicalities that had led to dismissals of prosecutions by the court. Legislation included guests who participated in the ceremony. The indigenous people were too large to police and the law too difficult to enforce. Duncan Campbell Scott convinced Parliament to change the offence from criminal to summary, which meant the agents, as justice of the peace, could try a case, convict, and sentence. Even so, except in a few small areas, the law was generally perceived as harsh and untenable. Even the Indian agents employed to enforce the legislation considered it unnecessary to prosecute, convinced instead that the Pushlatch would diminish as younger, educated, and more advanced Indians took over from the older Indians, who clung tenaciously to the custom. Persistence equals, sustaining the customs and culture of their ancestors. Indigenous people now openly hold Pushlatches to commit to the restoring of their ancestors' ways. Pushlatches now occur frequently and increasingly more over the years as families reclaim their birthright. The ban was repealed in 1951. Anthropological theory. In his book The Gift, the French ethnologist, Marcel Mauss used the term Pushlatch to refer to a whole set of exchange practices in tribal societies characterized by total prestations, that is, a system of gift-giving with political, religious, kinship and economic implications. These societies' economies are marked by the competitive exchange of gifts, in which gift-givers seek to outgive their competitors so as to capture important political, kinship and religious roles. Other examples of this Pushlatch type of gift economy include the Kula ring found in the Trobriand Islands. See also, Athabascan Pushlatch, competitive altruism, conspicuous consumption, gift economy, Guideboard, French situationist writer on the subject of Pushlatch and commodity reification. Koa, a similar concept among the Maori, Kula ring, a similar concept in the Trobriand Islands, list of bibliographical materials on the Pushlatch, Mocha exchange, a similar concept in Papua New Guinea, Potlatch, powwow a gathering whose name is derived from the Narragansett word for spiritual leader. References. External links, Mr. Museum of Pushlatch Artifacts. Pushlatch an exhibition from the Peabody Museum, Harvard University. University of Washington Libraries Digital Collections Oliver S. Van Eylinder Photographs A collection of photographs depicting life on Vashon Island, Whidbey Island, Seattle and other communities around Puget Sound, Washington. Photographs of Native American activities such as documentation of a Pushlatch on Whidbey Island.